Sometimes I tend to forget to turn things on. So, how's your memory doing today? Good. Can I challenge you on that? No? The world has changed, right? Quite a bit over the years. Do you remember back in the day when there was just the corded telephones, the touch tile telephones, or the ones that go brrr, brrr? Remember those phones? That was some time ago. Let me ask you this. When you had those telephones, how many telephone numbers could you remember? 3. Somebody said 3. You remember your phone number from back then? Yeah. Oh my. Amazing. My grandmother could remember anyone's phone number. She remembered our home phone number, her home phone number, her brother's home phone number, her son's phone number. She had a list of like 15, 20 numbers that she could remember, and she would just dial it in. Let me ask you, how many telephone numbers can you remember today? I can remember 2. It's all there, right? I can remember 2, mine and Lazelle's, and only because it's different by like 10 digits. And I can remember the first 3 digits of Joshua's, 509. The rest is on my device. It's interesting today how we struggle to remember telephone numbers. I guess it's interesting today that we struggle to remember almost period. How many birthdays do you remember? I know mine. And Joshua's, who's a few days after mine, and Lazelle's. My dad's, I always kind of get that wrong. Not intentionally. But it's difficult to remember, don't you think? And we often say, I will remember that when I need to. Have you ever said that? And then how often do you remember it? Never. Or we say, well, I'll put it on my device. And so the reason why we don't need to remember is because everything is on our phone or on some electronic device. What would happen, God forbid, if we had no electronic devices anymore? Yeah. We would all of a sudden have to remember everybody's telephone number. Your brain would function more. Yeah, probably. Sometimes we justify not being able to remember because there is so much to remember. Back in the day, maybe life wasn't as crazy as what it is today. But remembering is challenging, right? And so Jesus says, do this in remembrance of me. And the sermon's titled, Do This. So when Jesus says, do this in remembrance of me, what is he saying? What does he say, do this in remembrance of me? What is he referring to with regards to this idea of remember? Don't forget, yes. And so for us, remembering is most often just a cognitive function. Oh, I remember. Oh, yeah, I remember. I remember back in the day when I was at school, high school, I was part of cadets. All schools in South Africa did cadets. You had to do it so that you could be prepared to go to the army. You knew how to drill. You knew how to do all these things. You knew the various commands. So when you went into the military, you would not be ignorant of what was going on. And that was because South Africa was involved in a war in Angola. And so they wanted the kids, when you go into high school, to be attuned with what military required. And so I was part of cadets, and being part of cadets, I was also part of a small group of cadets officers that participated in what we called Remembrance Day. Happened on November 11 at 11 o'clock in the morning. And it was on that day that you remembered all the fallen soldiers from the First and Second World War. And if you had a soldier that had died that was in the community or had some association with the school that you were at, you would read the names. And I remember standing there at attention, it's like, oh, and the list would go on and on and on, and it's hot under the beret, and you're sweating bullets, and it's so uncomfortable. But that was Remembrance Day. And we do it here, right? It's maybe not necessarily Remembrance Day, but we remember all those who served in the armed forces. Veterans Day. But we remember them. Oh, that was nice. And off we go. But is this the kind of remembering that Jesus is talking about? We might argue yes. Yeah, Jesus wants us to remember cognitively of what he's done. And I don't think we necessarily grasp the scope of what Jesus has done. I was just listening to a book, and I mentioned it in the lesson study. If you were at the lesson study today, it was such a blessing to hear everybody communicate and share what the lesson study meant to them. So I encourage you to come to the lesson study. At 9:45. But I said to the lesson study class, I said, I'm listening to a book, A Case for Christ, and the author, Lee Strobel, goes to a medical doctor to find out, did Jesus really die on the cross? Because some say he didn't. Some say he faked his death, and so on and so on. And the reason why I'm sharing this is because we don't know the full concept of what Jesus did for us. And I did not know this, that in the Old Testament, I think they reference the Psalms. In the Psalms, it says that the bones of Jesus were taken out of socket, dislocated. I did not know that. And when I learned that yesterday, it was because of the position that Jesus was in on the cross, the arms extended this way and up, that when he hung and he fully had to carry his weight, at that point in time, his shoulders dislocated. Can you imagine that? Unreal. On top of, I won't share the other gory details, but on top of everything else, I was like, I did not know he dislocated his shoulders. And I did not know that dislocation of his shoulders was a fulfillment of a prophecy. Amazing, right? Anyways, Jesus calls us to remember what he's done for us. But is it just a concept of, yeah, I remember? The Greeks back in the time had a saying that time wipes out all things. And the concept is that our brains are like a blackboard. Remember the old blackboards? When you write in school, they were green. And if the teacher didn't write correctly with the chalk, it would make that screeching noise, or your fingernails on the board. Can you still hear it? Yeah. It says our brains are basically like a blackboard that when it gets a cloth that has water on it and it just wipes whatever else was on the blackboard out. Time does that to our brains. I would be tempted to ask, what was the sermon last week all about? And sometimes we really need to sit down and scratch our head. I even get asked, so what did you preach about last week? And I'm like, was this? Time wipes everything out, right? And we tend to forget. So, to properly understand this call to remember, we need to understand the context of the Old Testament. And Jesus uses a specific Greek word of this word remember. He uses a specific Greek word that's used in only 3 other passages, including this one in the New Testament. You don't find it anywhere else. But this this word remember is intended to take those who are listening to Jesus at this Last Supper back to the Passover. So Jesus says, do this in remembrance of me. He's saying, I want you to think of the past, and I want the past to now become a present in your life. So take the past Passover, remember that, and teleport it into your life today. And so Jesus says to us today, I want you to remember the past, when Jesus says, do this in remembrance of me, but I also want you to remember the past of the Old Testament of what happened with regards to the Passover, and take that freedom from slavery, what Jesus institutes because of his sacrifice, and bring it now into the present. I want you to remember in that context. And there's a lot. I mean, you can preach a whole year on what happened in Christ's death that he calls us to remember, and you can preach a whole year on what Christ calls us to remember with regards to the Passover. It's tons of information. And I'd like to summarize it or to distill it down to one concept: freedom from sin, freedom from slavery. And Jesus says at the Passover in the Old Testament, that is what was realized: freedom from Egyptian slavery. And what is realized at the cross? Freedom from slavery to sin and Satan. So Jesus says, I want you to remember that. I want that freedom of the Old Testament and of the gospel and of what Jesus Christ has done for us to become a reality that is effective in your life. This is what this idea of this remember that Jesus wants us to remember. It's not just, that was a nice concept. But it needs to become effective in your life. One of the commentaries writes, it says, this idea of remembering, it requires reflection on his sacrifice, worship of him, obedience to his commandments. It obligates the disciple to be a servant, to resist Satan, to stand firm in faith, and to strengthen others. So when Jesus says, remember what I've done for you, it encapsulates not just the cognitive memory, but it also encapsulates how that memory or that remembering impacts your life today. And how that impact is to direct you in the future. Because it's called here to resist Satan, to worship God, to be obedient, to stand firm in faith, to strengthen others. It's not just talking about cognitive memory, but how that cognitive memory is going to impact you now when you leave church. When you leave church now, and we've remembered what Jesus has done for us, how are we now going to live? The command of Christ to do this in remembrance of me links our present relationship with Christ to the past, but also to the future presence of Jesus Christ at the second coming. Because his death, in his death, he assures us that he will come again. And so when Jesus says, remember me, he says, remember the fact that you've been freed from slavery, you're freed from sin, but now also remember that there is the promise assured of my second coming. And how are we going to live in the reality of the coming from now and forevermore when we remember what Christ has done for us? Are we going to continue with resentment of others? are we going to live in extension of forgiveness to others, regardless of them requesting it or not? Are we going to live as idle Christians that just warm seats? The hope of the coming of Christ and the future begs the question, what do I do in the interim? How do I live between now and when Christ comes? How do I interact with people around me, even though I may not like them? How do I interact with my boss who gives me a hard time? How do I handle situations that I really don't want to be in? How do I handle a difficult marriage? How do I handle when I've been praying for something and there's been no answer? How do I manage when it seems as though God does not listen? To the prayers not for myself, but for the well-being and advancement of others. How do I live in that interim? The words of Christ does not just call us to cognitive recollection of his sacrifice, but also it should provide the impetus for response and action in the believer. So as we remember the death of Christ today, and the suffering and the freedom that that death brings to us, it should prompt us into action. If Jesus did not just mean think about me, then remembering him must reshape how I live between now and his return. Most of us have digital reminders, right? You put all your stuff into your calendar or your reminder on your phone, remind me at this time to do this. But do we have spiritual reminders? I was speaking to Dennis. It was 2008 that accident took place in the Bering Sea. I don't know how far that is from Alaska. I should look on the map. But there's an accident that takes place in the Bering Sea. It's called the Deadliest Sea. It's about a shipping trawler that goes down. And prior to the shipping trawler embarking upon its journey, I don't know what they call them, viewers. A viewer comes on board that sails with the ship. And the viewer has a checklist that it needs to go through, a safety checklist. And if some of these areas are not compliant, then the ship cannot sail. Well, it was a diesel engine, so how does a diesel engine sail? Well, a ship could not leave the harbor. And so this observer, who is independent of the fishing company, goes through the inspection. And the one thing that is noted on the inspection is, or as they're going through the inspection of the ship, is that one of the doors that leads to the rudder room, that its watertight seal is no longer watertight. And whoever, I forget who it was in the book, says to this person who's doing the inspection, "That's okay." And so they just bypass it and they carry on their journey. And not long after they started their journey, they begin to realize that the rudder room is flooding. And they begin to realize that the watertight sealed door is not longer watertight anymore, and it's busy filling up, and the water is leaking out the door. The water pumps to get the water out, they're not working. They can't. There was a number of things that went wrong. But there was a checklist. And so they go at the end of the book. There were 47 people aboard that ship. 45 the Coast Guard saved. 3 were lost. It says that's the greatest sea rescue that the Coast Guard has ever done. 45 people saved. And at the end of the book, they go through an investigation as to what happened. And they find out from this lady who did the checklist, this independent person that was sailing with the ship, they find out all the things that contributed to the fact that the ship sank. And one of the biggest contributing factors was the fact that this door, the watertight seal, did not seal. And so I share this because this was a reminder that this boat is not safe. Because it was flagged by this lady, but nothing was ever done about it. Because it could just like slide on by. And so it was marked in the report afterwards that this was the major contributing factor for the sinking of this ship. And so when we look at our lives, and we think about our lives as we sail through life, if you please, the digital markers that we have, the things that we save in our phones to remind us to do certain things, we have the same digital reminders, the same, or we have digital reminders in our spiritual journey to remind us to do certain things so that our ship does not sink. But I wonder sometimes whether our ships are not sinking. I wonder if we're not listening to the side. At one stage, then, as the boat had like a 45-degree list to the one side, and it was just unbearable for the people to get off the boat. They had to just jump into the water. Frigid, ice-cold water with what they called Gumby suits. These huge things that make them look like the Michelin Man. I digress. Reminders. What reminder do you have in your journey with God to stay connected with Him? Christ says this, the Sabbath. Christ says, "Do this in remembrance of me." What spiritual reminder do you have? Sabbath is once a week, and it's a great reminder. But what do you do Sunday through Friday?
Daily communion with the Lord.
Do you spend time with God? Do you engage with God in prayer and Bible study? Do you contemplate God in your daily life, in your daily walk with Him through the week? These are reminders, spiritual reminders to keep us on track. If they had maintained that watertight seal, that boat would never have sank. Yeah, the rudder room would have flooded, but it would not have leaked out into the rest of the ship. The engine wouldn't be impacted, the lights wouldn't have gone out, the boat wouldn't have gone in reverse. it would have been okay. They would have been able to turn the ship around and sail back to wherever they came from. God calls us today to remember Him. And I want to encourage us to set reminders every day to connect with God. So what are some checklists, some spiritual reminders that we can have? A reminder for prayer. A reminder to spend time with God in His Word. And these activities help us to remember what Christ has done, that then positively impacts and molds and shapes our lives for His kingdom. So today, as we partake of the foot washing and the emblems, may this spark in us a remembrance of Christ. And may that create the impetus to create daily spiritual reminders of Him, so that it can positively impact our life between now and the coming of Christ. I pray that God will bless all of us as we make these choices each and every day, that will be drawn to Him, and that our spiritual reminders will keep us on track. May God bless us all. Amen.